Welcome back to those of you who have been with us for the previous two sessions, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. My name is Linda Rich, and I chair the Justice and Witness Missional Team for the Hawaii Conference of the United Church of Christ, which is the organization that is hosting this series of lectures. We are so happy to again have Dr. Keanu Sai with us, who today will be talking with us about the illegal overthrow and the continued existence of the Hawaiian Kingdom as a state. We will be taking questions and answers at the end of the presentation, and Cassie Chi, who's a member of the Justice and Witness Missional Team, will be moderating the question and answer period. I want to acknowledge Kalania Kea Wilson, who is also on the Justice and Witness Missional Team and has been the person who brought the idea of this series forward and who made the contacts with our three scholars who are presenting with us. Welcome to Kahu Brian Welsh, who is the Luna Ho'omalu for the Hawaii Association of Hawaiian Evangelical Churches.
Thank you, Linda. On behalf of the Association of Hawaiian Evangelical Churches, we want to give our extreme thanks to all the hard work that has gone in to make this presentation possible. I was with Kalania Kea for about 3 hours yesterday for our Board of Directors meeting, and they all wanted to express their great gratitude and appreciation to you personally, Linda Rich, and to the Justice and Witness team for making these sessions possible. We thank, in particular, Dr. Keanu Sai for today's presentation. I'm going to open us with prayer. Would we bow our heads together? He puli kako. We thank you, great God, loving Father, that you have granted us truth in this world. And we know that the words of Scripture which say, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. James 1:5. We thank you for those words of promise, that as we seek wisdom, that it will be given to us, and we are asking for your these powerful issues received from these wonderful and talented researchers, these people of the highest caliber or experience. We would pray that you continue to give them wisdom as they share with us, and that you would continue to allow us to experience these wonderful truths that are coming to us. We're grateful for our Savior, Jesus Christ, who told us that we can know the truth and it will set us free. We know that's in relationship, first of all, to our personal relationship with God himself, but also in this life, we should be always pursuers of truth, and we're grateful for that passion. As we receive today with gratitude in our hearts, we pray that you would just empower our speaker, Dr. Sai. In the name and power of our Savior, Jesus Christ, I say amen and amen. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Kahu Brian. And now, Dr. Sai.
All right. Okay. Aloha and mahalo, Linda, and everyone else for putting this on. So this is my third presentation of 4. So next week Sunday is my last one. But a little background about myself for those who don't know who I am. I'm a graduate of the Kamehameha Schools, 1982. After Kamehameha Schools, went on to a military college, New Mexico Military Institute, where I got my commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Reserve and an associate's degree. And then transferred to University of Hawaii, got my bachelor's, and that was in 1987. I spent 10 years in the military, in both active and reserve, in the Hawaii Army National Guard, field artillery. I was a field artillery officer. My last command was Charlie Battery. Got out as a captain, honorably discharged, and then I began to look into my history, just for a personal note, and a bit of a kauoha from, not kauoha, well, yeah, I guess it was from my tutu, that I needed to know my genealogy. And that, you might say, took me down that rabbit hole. Now, what I bring into this presentation of Hawaii's history is a political science approach, not a cultural approach, right? But a political science approach. I received my master's degree in political science, specializing in international relations in 2004. And then I was able to get my Ph.D. in political science, focusing on the history of the Hawaiian Kingdom, applying international relations and law. And What I bring here is a theoretical framework that has not been used, because people have often asked me, why haven't other people found this? And it wasn't that I found it, it was always there, but just nobody could explain it. And that's what I bring to the table. Okay. Also, my family, I forgot to say, is part of Kaumakapili Church. And I noticed Uncle Henry Aaron is here, and that's Ohana. So just wanted to make that connection. Today, we're going to be covering the illegal overthrow of the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. You notice I didn't say the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, but rather the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and you'll see why. Well, in 1875, King Kalakaua negotiated a reciprocity trade agreement, commercial agreement with the United States. One of the provisions was that Hawaiian sugar would enter the American market duty-free, along with other products coming out of Hawaii, and that certain American products would enter into the Hawaiian market duty-free. Okay. Up to 1884, Hawaiian sugar production was a lucrative business. Now, American sugar producers who could not compete against Hawaiian sugar as a result of the aftermath of the Civil War that outlawed slavery, protested the continuation of the treaty, which would last until 1885 unless an agreement was made to extend it. In 1884, the United States offered extending the treaty on condition of a lease to Pearl Harbor to be used for recoaling American ships. Now, Kalakaua, under Hawaiian law, needed the approval of the Hawaiian legislature in order to extend the commercial treaty. In both the 1884 and 1886 legislative sessions, the legislature blocked it because it did not like the condition of exclusively leasing Pearl Harbor to the United States. Representatives like Joseph Navahi saw that as a first step of America entering and taking over Hawaii. This emboldened the sugar industry to walk down the path of treason driven by greed. During the summer of 1887, while the legislature was out of session, a minority of subjects of the kingdom and foreign nationals met to organize a revolution and take over the government. The driving motivation was sugar, and began to justify their actions by stating the native was unfit for government and his power must be curtailed. The group made demands on Kalakaua, including an immediate change of the king's cabinet. Under threat of violence, on July 1st, 1887, the king reluctantly agreed to form a new cabinet ministry made up of members of that group. On that day, each member of the new cabinet took an oath to support the Constitution and laws and faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of their office. Unbeknownst to the king, the new ministry made a request to have Chief Justice Judd and Associate Justice Preston assist in the preparation of a new constitution on July 5th, 1887, which implicated the two highest ranking judicial officials with treason. Now, in our last presentation, I was covering the constitutional history of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And by 1864, only the legislature can create law, not the judicial and not the executive branch. Hawaiian constitutional law provided that any change to the Constitution would have to be approved by the Legislative Assembly, which was still out of session and would not convene until 1888 unless called into a special session. Because the separation of powers doctrine was fully enshrined in the Constitution since 1864, the king, as the chief executive, was limited to faithfully executing the law and could not enact law on its own without the legislature's involvement. On July 5th, 1887, Chief Justice Albert F. Judd and Associate Justice Edward Preston joined the insurgents and assisted in drafting the Bayonet Constitution. By 12 noon on July 5th, 1887, a so-called constitution was drafted by the insurgents and laid before the king. Unbeknownst to Kalakaua that the Supreme Court was involved, he asked Chief Justice, who was present, for his opinion. Judge stated, You must follow the advice of your responsible ministers. On October 20th, 1887, the Cabinet Council ratified the 1884 Supplementary Convention, extending the commercial treaty another 7 years and giving the United States an exclusive lease to Pearl Harbor. This exclusive lease was also a violation of international law, which is the most favored nation clause in the treaties with other countries and a source of growing tension. What the most favored nation clause means is one country cannot give more than what it gave to another country, meaning it provides equality as to treatment, right, amongst members of the family of nations. So if the Hawaiian Kingdom was going to provide access to the United States as a lease, under a lease, to Pearl Harbor, the most favored nation clause, they also have to provide a lease for all countries who are independent states. Charles Gulick, the former Minister of the Interior from 1883 to 1886, concluded, the ready acquiescence of the king to their demands seriously disconcerted the conspirators, as they had hoped that his refusal would have given them an excuse for deposing him, and a show of resistance a justification for assassination. Then everything would have been plain sailing for the little oligarchy with the sham Republican Constitution. The so-called 1887 Constitution came to be known as the Bayonet Constitution and was never submitted to the Legislative Assembly for approval. It was drafted by a select of 20 individuals, effectively placed control of the legislature and cabinet in the hands of individuals who held foreign allegiances. Unlike Kamehameha V, Kalakaua, as the chief executive, did not have the constitutional authority to abrogate and then subsequently promulgate a new constitution without legislative approval. The Constitution of 1864 no longer had the sovereign prerogative of Article 45. Thus, the Crown was limited to faithfully executing Hawaiian law as the country's chief executive. So going over what we covered last week, circumstances of the 1864 Constitution. In his speech at the opening of the Legislative Assembly of 1864, Kamehameha V explained and justified his action of promulgating a new constitution under Article 45 of the 1852 Constitution. He stated to the Legislative Assembly in his speech that the 45th article that reserved to the sovereign the right to conduct personally in cooperation with the Kuhina Nui or Premier, but without the intervention of a ministry or the approval of the legislature, such portions of the public business as he might choose to undertake. Kamehameha V saw that this act he needed to take was because of a public business that had to be done. And that was to bring out the Constitution of 1864 that limited the authority of the monarch. It did not increase it because Article 45 was not in that 1864 Constitution. Now, the 1864 Legislative Assembly appointed a special committee to respond to Kamehameha V's opening speech of the new legislature. The committee recognized the constitutionality of his actions and stated, and this is where it gets very interesting, stated that this prerogative converted into a right by the terms of the 1852 Constitution, your Majesty has now parted with, both for yourself and successors. And this assembly thoroughly recognizes the sound judgment by which your Majesty was actuated to the abandonment of a privilege, which at some future time might have been productive of untold evil to the nation. I don't think they knew that the Bayonet Constitution was coming up, but by removing Article 45, it prevented actions done that brought the 1887 Constitution or Bayonet Constitution. It's all illegal. Now, in 1890, the Congress enacted the McKinley Tariff Act that provided that all foreign sugar entering the American market would be duty-free. This forced the Hawaiian sugar to compete with foreign sugar in the American market and not just compete against American sugar. A seed was planted in the minds of the insurgents to find an opportunity to be annexed to the United States. On November 25th, 1890, King Kalakaua departed for San Francisco. On January 20th, 1891, the king died and his body returned to Honolulu on the 29th. That same day, Lili'uokalani, as heir apparent and confirmed to the throne by the Legislative Assembly, the House of Nobles, in 1877, was sworn in as queen. President Harrison sent John Stevens to the Hawaiian Kingdom as a US minister. In 1892, the Annexation Club was formed by the insurgents, and it was secret, with the support of US Minister Stevens. After the government was overthrown on January 17, 1893, Stevens sent a dispatch to the State Department on February 1st. The Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it. Well, when the government was overthrown, mind you, they did not necessarily overthrow the government, they just changed the head. So they replaced Queen Lili'uokalani, her cabinet, and Marshal Charles Wilson, head of the police force, replaced them with insurgents. And everyone in government was obligated to sign an oath of allegiance to the provisional government, right? So they're gonna say, you have to take this oath or you're not gonna have a job, or you could be put in jail. So that was a threat, right? And not everyone in the Hawaiian government signed this oath of allegiance. In particular, the Royal Hawaiian Band, they refused to sign it. And they asked Miss Prendergast, who was a lady in waiting with Queen Lili'uokalani, to draft a song, lyrics, to show their defiance. And that song today we know as Kaulana na Pua. It's actually titled Mele, Aloha, Āina, Patriot song. And many times it's played in Hawaiian, right? But here's a version that is in both Hawaiian and English so that you can appreciate the lyrics and what they actually were saying.
Famous are the children of Hawaii. Ever loyal to the land. When the uncaring messenger comes, with his greedy document of extortion. From the Big Island, Keawe answers. Help also comes from Pi'ilani. Mano's Kauai lends support. And so do the sands of Kakuhihewa. Write his name on the paper of the enemy. With its sin of annexation and the sale of native civil rights. We do not value the government's sums of money. We are satisfied with our stones, the astonishing food of the land. We back Liliulani, who has won the rights of the land. And now we tell the story again of the people who love their land. We will not rest until we have our lands.
So as you can see, it's some very powerful words, right? And Miss Prendergast was the composer, and she wrote it on behalf of the Royal Hawaiian Band, who refused to sign the Oath of Allegiance, which eventually led to them not having jobs anymore. And that's what was being done by these insurgents, was to use economics, which they controlled, against anyone who was against them. So in order to understand what exactly happened with the 1893 overthrow of a government, it needs to be understood within the framework of international law, as between the Hawaiian Kingdom and the United States, not between the Hawaiian government and the insurgents. And that the reason is because US Marines were involved, and that took it to another level, right? If it was just the insurgents, then it would be considered a revolution of whether or not they will be successful or not, right? But once these insurgents were propped up and backed up by the US Marines and Minister Stevens, it now brought in international law. So we need to understand what is international law first, and then we need to look at what actually happened. Now, Judge Greenwood from the International Court of Justice stated, traditional international law was based upon a rigid distinction between a state of peace and a state of war. Countries were either in a state of peace or a state of war. There was no middle ground. And acts of war triggers a state of war. Keep that in mind. Acts of war triggers a state of war. And a state of war includes belligerent occupation. And you will notice that this separation of law and peace, peace and war, is also reflected in Professor Oppenheim, a very renowned professor of international law, where volume 1 of international law is peace, and volume 2, war and neutrality. By direction of Hawaii's Queen Liliuokalani, President Cleveland, in March of 1893, initiated the investigation of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom government on January 17, 1893. On December 18th, 11 months later, the president reported to the Congress his findings and conclusions of the investigation. He also previously reported his findings to Queen Liliuokalani that led to negotiations for settlement. President Cleveland's message to Congress, he stated, on the 16th day of January, 1893, between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a detachment of Marines from the United States steamer Boston with 2 pieces of artillery landed at Honolulu. The men, upwards of 160 in all, were supplied with double cartridge belts filled with ammunition and with haversacks and canteens, and were accompanied by a hospital corps with stretchers and medical supplies. He concluded that this military demonstration upon the soil of Honolulu was of itself an act of war. President Cleveland, as a head of state of the United States, acknowledged what the Queen acknowledged. Hawaii was invaded and a state of war was triggered. Once in a state of war, according to Professor Greenwood, the law of peace ceased to apply between the two states, and their relations with one another became subject to the laws of war, while their relations with other states not party to the conflict became governed by neutrality. Professor Venturini says, if an armed conflict occurs, the law of armed conflict must be applied from the beginning until the end, when the law of peace resumes in full effect, and that is by a treaty of peace. Queen Lili'uokalani, on January 17, 1893, provided a conditional surrender to the United States, not the insurgents. I, Lili'uokalani, by the grace of God and under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Queen, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom by certain persons claiming to have established a provisional government of and for this kingdom, that I yield to the superior force of the United States, whose Minister Plenipotentiary, His Excellency John Stevens, has caused United States troops to be landed at Honolulu and declared that he would support the provisional government. Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps the loss of life, I do this under protest and imperiled by said force, yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon the facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representatives and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. President Cleveland stated, this wrongful recognition of the provisional government by our minister placed the government of the Queen in a position of most perilous perplexity. On the one hand, she had the possession of the palace, of the barracks, and of the police station, and had at her command at least 500 fully armed men and several pieces of artillery. Indeed, the whole military force of her kingdom was on her side and at her disposal. In this state of things, if the Queen could have dealt with the insurgents alone, her course would have been plain and the result unmistakable. President Cleveland then stated, but the United States had allied itself with her enemies, had recognized them as the true government of Hawaii, and had put her and her adherents in the position of opposition against lawful authority. She knew that she could not withstand the power of the United States, but she believed that she might safely trust to its justice. He also concluded the provisional government owes its existence to an armed invasion by the United States. The provisional government was never a government put together by American businessmen, as constantly said today. No, they were insurgents pretending to be a government, but they were a puppet of United States Minister John Stevens. President Cleveland then concluded, by an act of war, the government of a friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. International law requires a treaty of peace in order to transform the state of war to a state of peace. There's no such treaty. Here we have the separation between state and government, which is important in international relations. The state is a subject of international law. Its government is the subject of that country's domestic law, its constitutional system. But in international relations, you can overthrow the government militarily by an act of war. That does not equate to the overthrow of the state. The state still exists, and that's what triggers what is called the laws of war with regard to occupation. So the laws of war in 1893 obligated the United States as the occupying state to administer the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom and not the laws of the United States when they are in effective control of the territory. They came into effective control of Hawaiian territory when Queen Lili'uokalani conditionally surrendered to the United States on January 17, 1893. This obligation is now codified under Article 43 of the 1907 Hague Regulations and Article 64 of the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention. The US did not administer Hawaiian Kingdom law and unilaterally annexed the Hawaiian Islands 5 years later during the Spanish-American War in 1898. Now, under international law, the military overthrow of a country's government does not equate to an overthrow of the country called a state. According to Professor Brownlee, after the defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, the four major Allied powers assumed supreme power in Germany. Effectively, the legal competence of the German state, its independence and sovereignty did not, however, disappear. What occurred is akin to legal representation or agency of necessity. This is administering the laws of the occupied state, where the occupier is serving as that temporary government. The German state continued to exist, and indeed, the legal basis of the occupation depended on its existence. So how does a state acquire the territory of another state under international law? Well, according to Professor Oppenheim, a leading expert, he says cession of state territory is the transfer of sovereignty over state territory by the owner state to another state. And the only form in which a cession can be effected is an agreement embodied in a treaty between the ceding and the acquiring state. So here we have two sovereign entities, two sovereign states represented by their governments. One government will cede territory to another government. Can be done during a time of peace or war. Here's the United States, and the United States initially only comprised of the East Coast and somewhat inland, right? As what used to be called the British colonies. Well, since 1783, when Great Britain acknowledged the 13 former colonies as 13 independent states in the Treaty of Paris, the United States eventually acquired ceded lands from other countries. The first was in 1803 from the French, Louisiana Purchase. Then what we know as Florida today, that was ceded by Spain in 1819, followed by the British in 1846, Alaska from the Russians in 1867, these cessions taking place during peace. In this situation, all territory north of the Rio Grande was acquired by the United States as a result of a state of war with Mexico. And that treaty took place in 1848, called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So what is the authority of Hawaii's cession? Everybody says ceded lands. Well, if there's ceded lands, got to be a treaty. Well, what we have here is joint resolution to provide for annexing the Hawaiian Islands to the United States. The 1898 Joint Resolution of Annexation is a municipal law. It's an American law passed by Congress. It's not a treaty. And what was said on the congressional records regarding the United States passing a law, annexing a foreign country? Well, many were making the record, but one in particular, Senator William Allen from Nebraska, stated on the record, the Constitution and the statutes are territorial in their operation. That is, they cannot have any binding force or operation beyond the territorial limits of the government in which they are promulgated. In other words, the Constitution and statutes cannot reach across the territorial boundaries of the United States into the territorial domain of another government and affect that government or persons or property therein. And he stated that the joint resolution of annexation is ipso facto null and void. Well, that did not deter the annexationists in Congress, because they went ahead and passed the law where they just need the majority, as they did with the joint resolution of annexation, passed the law changing the name of the Hawaiian Kingdom governmental infrastructure to the territory of Hawaii in 1900. And this is the Territorial Act. And then in 1959, the US Congress passed another law, changing the name from the territory of Hawaii to the state of Hawaii. But still, that governmental infrastructure is the Hawaiian Kingdom governmental infrastructure. And then in 1993, the United States Congress passes another joint resolution apologizing for the overthrow. And this resolution is riddled with misinformation. But nevertheless, it's still just an American law. Now, the United States Supreme Court in 1936 explained the limits of the US Constitution and its laws passed by Congress. It says neither the Constitution nor the laws passed in pursuance of it have any force in foreign territory, and operations of the nation in such territory must be governed by treaties, international understandings and compacts, and the principles of international law. Well, give some visual on the limitation of American law. Here you have Washington, D.C., where Congress is situated. You have borders. U.S. laws have no effect beyond the borders of the United States, which means the United States could no more annex Hawaii, being a foreign country, or even create a territorial government or a state government outside of its territory any more than it can try to annex Canada tomorrow and create a state government in Ottawa. Well, what were they saying back then in 1900? Well, Maui newspaper, October 20th, had a story on a person named Thomas Clark. It says here, Thomas Clark, a candidate for territorial senator from Maui, holds that it was an unconstitutional proceeding on the part of the United States to annex the islands without a treaty. And that, as a matter of fact, the islands are not annexed and cannot be. And that if the Democrats come into power, they will show the thing up in its true light and demonstrate that the islands are de facto independent at the present time. Wow. Thomas Clark knew Hawaii wasn't annexed and it was still independent. And then a response by the editor. Thomas, necessity knows no law. And it was absolutely necessary to annex the islands at the time it was done. And further, Thomas, if it becomes necessary to annex Cuba, it will be done quicker than a wink. It is but fair to give you credit for being honest in your views, Thomas, but you don't quite understand the American people just yet. Hence, you are very misleading. Interesting. The bubble had begun to be created. Well, who is this guy, Thomas? Well, here he is. He was one of the signatories on the petition against annexation, which killed the treaty. And there his name, Thomas Clark, age 42, next to his name written Hawaiian. Now in 1988, the US Department of Justice, Office of Legal Counsel questions Hawaii's annexation. The Office of Legal Counsel cited constitutional scholar Professor Willoughby, who wrote, and this is in the opinion, the constitutionality of the annexation of Hawaii by a simple legislative act was strenuously contested at the time, both in Congress and by the press. The right to annex by treaty was not denied, but it was denied that this might be done by a simple legislative act. Only by means of treaties, it was asserted, can the relations between states be governed, for a legislative act is necessary without extraterritorial force confined in its operation to the territory of the state whose legislature enacted it. The Office of Legal Counsel then concluded in its opinion in 1988, it is unclear which constitutional power of Congress exercised when it acquired Hawaii by joint resolution. Accordingly, it is doubtful that the acquisition of Hawaii can serve as an appropriate precedent for a congressional assertion of sovereignty over an extended territorial sea, about 2,500 miles worth of an extended territorial sea. Under international law, annexation of a state without its consent is unlawful. According to the Handbook of Humanitarian Law in Armed Conflicts, which is the laws of war, the international law of belligerent occupation must therefore be understood as meaning that the occupying power is not sovereign, but exercises provisional and temporary control over foreign territory. The legal situation of the territory can be altered only through a peace treaty. International law does not permit annexation of territory of another state. So why is it that we don't know this? Well, it's called denationalization. Here's a picture of Samuel Damon, who was serving at the time as trustee of the Kamehameha schools, right? And he, on the record, stated, as part of the so-called Republic of Hawaii, the insurgents, he stated, if we're ever to have peace and annexation, the first thing to do is to obliterate the past. You know, this is 1895, 3 years before the United States just took Hawaii. Denationalization under international law is to obliterate the national consciousness of the occupied state in the minds of the people, but you really can only apply it and attempt to apply it over children. Now, in 1919, denationalization was listed as a war crime, titled Attempts to Denationalize the Inhabitants of Occupied Territory. Stemming from Italy's occupation in the Second World War, Yugoslav Charge 1434 stated that apart from killing, deporting, and interning innocent persons, the Italians started a policy on a vast scale of denationalization. As part of such policy, they started a system of re-education of Yugoslav children. This re-education consisted of forbidding children to use the Serbo-Croat language, to sing Yugoslav songs, and to force them to salute in a fascist way. You also had in the indictment Germanization. This indictment is against Hermann Goering and Rudolf Hess and others, right? And this is count 3, war crimes. Germanization of occupied territories. In certain occupied territories purportedly annexed to Germany, the defendants, methodically and pursuant to plan, endeavored to assimilate those territories politically, culturally, socially, and economically into the German Reich. The defendants endeavored to obliterate the former national character of these territories. In pursuance of these plans and endeavors, the defendants forcibly deported inhabitants who were predominantly non-German and introduced thousands of German colonists. This plan included economic domination, physical conquest, installation of puppet governments, purported de jure or lawful annexation, and enforced conscription or drafting into the German armed forces. This was carried out in most of the occupied countries, including Norway, France, Soviet Union, Luxembourg, Denmark, Belgium, and Holland, or the Netherlands. Well, here in Hawaii in 1906, a pamphlet titled Program for Patriotic Exercises in the Public Schools was published by the government of the territory of Hawaii. The theme of the program was to indoctrinate the children of the Hawaiian Islands to be American and to speak English. Harper's Weekly magazine sent a reporter to Hawaii in 1906 to watch the implementation of this plan, right? And he visited 3 schools, Ka'iolani Public School, Ka'ahumanu Public School, and Honolulu High School before the name was changed to President William McKinley High School in 1911. Here's a picture of 714 school children at Ka'iolani Public School who, at the order and command of the principal, stand at attention and salute the American flag. And here the caption under the photo says, the children all yell in unison, "We give our heads and our hearts to God and our country. One country, one language, one flag." This scene shows a salute to the American flag, which flies in the grounds of the Ka'iolani Public School, which has many Japanese pupils. The drill is constantly held as a means of inculcating patriotism in the hearts of the children. The term inculcate is brainwashing through repetition. Within 2 generations, the national consciousness of the Hawaiian Kingdom was obliterated and replaced through Americanization. They interfered with the methods of education, compelled education in the English language, only taught American and not Hawaiian Kingdom history, migrated thousands of American citizens to the Hawaiian Islands, drafted Hawaiian subjects for US wars, imposed American laws, imposed American administrative and judicial systems, and imposed American financial and economic administration. Then you also have the propaganda of a treaty of cession. Here in this book written by Caspar Whitney, Hawaiian America, which was dedicated to Sanford Dole and Lauren Thurston. He wrote, President McKinley, June 16, 1897, signed another annexation treaty, which was submitted to the Senate and ratified July 6, 1898, after Dewey's victory at Manila had made ratification imperative. The problem is this is not true. It's not a treaty, it was a joint resolution. Another piece of propaganda. This is a booklet put out by the US State Department titled History of the Department of State, 1901. It says here, a treaty was negotiated by Secretary Foster, agreed upon by both parties, and sent to the Senate by President Harrison on February 14, 1893. That's correct. The treaty was withdrawn by President Cleveland. That's correct. President McKinley revived the question, and the treaty was ratified by both parties. Not true. It was a joint resolution. And then in the Supreme Court, there was an appeal that came from the territory. And in the appeal, it stated that the United States was a necessary party, that the property described in the petition having been transferred and ceded to the United States by the Treaty of Annexation of July 7, 1898. Nope, not true. And President William McKinley statue at President William McKinley High School. And he's there holding a document. And this was dedicated, this statue was dedicated by Sanford Dole, right? 1911. President McKinley is holding a document in his hand. What is he holding? Well, it's supposed to be the document of annexation. Does it say joint resolution? Nope, not true. As Donald James Weil, British novelist known as Dresden James, wrote, when a well-packaged web of lies has been sold gradually to the masses over generations, the truth would seem utterly preposterous and its speaker, a raving lunatic. Closing statements. According to Professor Cohen, the state must be distinguished from the government. The state, not the government, is the major player, the legal person in international law. And according to Judge Crawford, there is a presumption that the state continues to exist with its rights and obligations, despite a period in which there is no effective government, or even no government at all. And belligerent occupation does not affect the continuity of the state, even when there exists no government claiming to represent the occupied state. And finally, while under belligerent occupation, the United States is still in a state of war with the Hawaiian Kingdom. So that brings my presentation to a close. I'd like to pass it on to Cassie.
Mahalo, Dr. Sai, for another great and totally information-packed presentation. As always, if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as we can today. Well, to start, Dr. Sai, that quote in response to Thomas, necessity knows no law, that really struck me. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the kind of bubble you started to mention and like what was starting to be created there in terms of like misinformation.
Well, to borrow what is being used today, the big lie, right? So they start the big lie, and how you maintain the big lie, if it just came from a few people, is you put it in newspapers, you put it in publications, you spread it, you put it in the schools, it becomes a part of curriculum, and all of a sudden, the big lie is not a lie, it's the truth. And that is an amazing story in and of itself, in that we have been victimized by a big lie, but now we're uncovering the truth, and it gets very uncomfortable because for a lot of people, oh boy, this is hitting, some hard hitting facts. It's like, imagine all your life, people have been calling you Clarissa, and then you find your birth certificate and it says Gertrude.
Right, yeah.
There's some reckoning here.
Yeah.
Why was the name changed, or was it changed legally, or is it still Gertrude? But people think, especially that person who carries that name, say, no, I'm still Carissa.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sai. Let's see. Has the information you have presented been taken up in a court of law in The Hague?
Well, this information actually was presented and laid out at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in proceedings before in The Hague in Larson versus the Hawaiian Kingdom. That's going to be a topic of next week, because next week's presentation is getting into the now what? In light of this information, what do you do, right? Because it is a very complicated situation. This is not a matter of convincing people, right, that it's a big lie. Take a look at what's happening today. I think that's a good a thing to watch, where no matter how many times you talk to someone who believes a big lie and you show the facts, no, they say, no, I still believe it. So that's a word to the wise. That doesn't work here. So this is not a matter of forcing people to believe it, but there had to have been a plan developed, which I'll be covering next week, that takes that idea as a variable in the equation, but not as a strategy to counter, right?
Right.
And that's where my military training comes in as a field artillery officer, where before you come up with a battle plan, you gotta have good intel, right? You look at how the opposing force fought, you gotta look at how they won, how they succeeded, but you also have to understand how they did not succeed and what they didn't do. And then that informs a battle plan. But here, the battle that we have is not physically against people. Our battle is the engagement of using the truth as a weapon, right? So what we're doing is, it's really a revolution, but I call it a cerebral revolution. It's all in your head, you know, that's all it is. Because once you see it, you see it. Now, if you don't see it, or you refuse to see it, then psychology has those kind of things that can be taken care of through clinical psychological work called confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, what is it? Stockholm syndrome. You know, I'm glad America took us because somebody would have. You know, that's more a victim mentality, but it's more psychological than it is legal and factual. So we have to understand there's so many variables here that play into this situation. It is very complex, no doubt.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to that then, the next presentation, talking more about strategy. The next question is, if Hawaiian Evangelical Church officers committed treason in 1893, what would have happened to them and their property if indicated, if maybe it's indicted, if indicated at the time?
Okay, good question. So this information that I covered is in chapter 2 of the Royal Commission of Inquiry. So if people can read chapter 2, it'll probably answer some of the questions that people may have. But what I'm going to respond to with regard to that question is in chapter 2. So before President Cleveland delivered his message to Congress on December 18th, he contacted Queen Lili'uokalani through his ambassador, Albert Willis, on November 13th, 1893, for a meeting that the Queen would have in the Hawaiian legation, in the American legation of the US Embassy in Honolulu, right? Which is just adjacent to where the state capitol is, right? That's where the American Embassy used to be. Now, what was conveyed to the Queen was President Cleveland, through Willis, said that he apologized. It was through the unlawful intervention of the United States minister that caused this situation. But many people committed treason. They not just became accessories, but they were principals. Minister Stevens and Captain Wiltz of the USS Boston had diplomatic immunity. People like Lauren Thurston, Sanford Dole, even Americans involved, they didn't have diplomatic immunity. And they were subjected to the treason statute, because even aliens can commit treason in the Hawaiian Kingdom, as aliens can commit treason in America, right? So what the president wanted, and that's what started that negotiation, was to ask whether or not the Queen would grant amnesty to these individuals who committed treason after she is restored. So he wanted to get that agreement. The Queen didn't want that. She said, it's not personal. She just cited chapter 6 of the Hawaiian Penal Code. It's treason. And under Hawaiian law, amnesty cannot be granted until after the conviction, not before. Now, under American law, amnesty or a pardon can be granted before the conviction. And you saw that happen with President Trump. He was granting pardons to people who weren't even prosecuted, indicted yet, but it protected them. The Hawaiian Kingdom is a different constitutional system. You can only be pardoned after conviction. It's in the Constitution, right? So the Queen had to deal with that. And that's what makes it even more complex for the Queen at that time, negotiating with an American who's operating under their view of their law. And here's the Queen operating under her understanding of our law, but still trying to resolve it. Well, after 3 additional meetings, on December 18th, 1893, the same day President Cleveland delivered his message, the Queen agreed to grant amnesty. Okay? And that was sent to the president, but he didn't receive it until after he gave the message. But political wrangling in Congress prevented Cleveland from restoring the Queen. So the Queen wasn't restored. What is important here is President Cleveland acknowledged that these individuals committed high treason. That means they would be subjected to Hawaiian law. And under Hawaiian law, after conviction, you lose your property to the government and you get executed, you get hung, right? So what you have here, because the queen was not restored, these insurgents became fugitives of Hawaiian law, pretending to be a government, right? And then the United States in the background, you had annexationists that wanted Hawaii, not because of the sugar situation. They wanted Hawaii as a military outpost to protect the west coast of the United States by having Hawaii being militarily fortified to prevent what they saw at that time, a Japanese invasion of the west coast.
Thank you, Dr. Sai. Maybe let's do one more question and then we'll wrap up for today. How does this relate to Israel and Palestine? If you want to comment on that.
Good question. Very good question. So the history of Palestine is very different than the history of the Hawaiian Kingdom with regard to being a state or an independent state. And I say state or an independent state because these are two separate legal standings, right? So Palestine is actually what is called a mandate territory. So after World War I, okay, Germany and the Ottoman Turks basically were forced to give up their territories, okay? So Ottoman Turks used to be in control of the Middle East, but it was reduced to what we know today as Turkey. Germany had to release territories they had in the Pacific, namely Samoa, right? So Samoa became a mandate territory under the administration of New Zealand, okay? Well, in the case of Palestine, that area called Palestine, which includes what we call today as Israel, which didn't exist at that time, okay, as part of the Ottoman Empire. It was called Palestinian territory with Jewish people in it, as well as Muslims. And Palestine was identified by the League of Nations as a mandate territory under the administration of Great Britain. And as a mandate territory, basically it's mandated for them to become an independent state, and Great Britain was supposed to facilitate that, right? Like how New Zealand facilitated Samoa to become an independent state, okay, as a former mandate territory. But as the other mandate territories became independent states, Jordan, Lebanon, the last one was Palestine. And what complicated issues was World War II. Okay? So World War II and the Zionist movement, actually you had insurgents who were Jewish bombing British officials in that area called Palestine, right? Because there was some tension going on. But after World War II, an agreement was made that Jewish people in Europe could migrate into Israel. And that's when steps were taken where they declared the Israeli state, right? And then they expelled the Palestinians. Since then, the Palestinians have been trying to say, you know, we need to be a state because that mandate was there before Israel declared themselves, right? So eventually things took place where Palestine was recognized as a state, but not as an independent state. An independent state is a subject of international law. A state is just a fixed, defined territory with laws and a central government or a governing system, like the state of New York, right? New York is not an independent state. So you have a state of Palestine. Now, state of Palestine was acknowledged, its statehood, to be a member, a non-UN member of the United Nations. So they can sit there, but they're a non-member state, but a state, but they're not independent because the United States does not recognize it. Israel doesn't recognize it, be Canada. And for that situation, because it was formerly a mandate territory, it needs universal recognition of independence, not just like a majority of states. For us, different, very different. The Hawaiian Kingdom, well, it used to be British, right? So when Great Britain recognized Hawaiian independence in 1843, we didn't need other countries to recognize our independence because we weren't a mandate system under a League of Nations. This was just Great Britain. So we needed Great Britain to recognize Hawaiian independence, which was achieved on November 28, 1843. once the Hawaiian Kingdom was an independent state, it entered into diplomatic relations with other countries, not that it needed their recognition. And that's important. So that's why for Hawaii, as an established independent state, what was overthrown in 1893 was the government, not the state. Now, this also, I want to share just a short story here because it deals directly with Palestine. I was asked to present to 100 officers, foreign officers, right? Colonel level, right? Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And they were all part of what is called the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. that comes under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So these are foreign officers that go to get a master's degree. And it's like a working relationship with the United States, but these officers come in. Well, I was asked to give a presentation to them a few months back at East West Center. And when I provided my presentation, which was pretty much what you folks saw here, right, in this presentation, they were shocked because these military officers understand what I'm talking about because I was an officer too, and I was using military lingo. And their eyes was wide open, occupation of Hawaii, war crimes, and Hawaii still being a country. After my presentation, I was approached by a colonel from the Israeli Defense Force. So he comes up to me and he says, Dr. Sai, when you mention that Palestine is a state, I have to say I disagree because it's not. I said, no, it is a state, but it's not an independent state. And he goes, yes. Okay, now I got it. I said, yeah, I'm not saying they're an independent state. I'm saying they're a state that still needs international recognition universally, right? And then he goes, yes. And then he tells me, but Hawaii is different. You folks were a state and you still are a state. I said, yeah. So here's a military officer who's from the Israeli Defense Force, who's a colonel, got it, not because his background in political science, but he got it because he was military. And he is there on the ground. And that was interesting that there was this type of communication that was done between us, with me being a former officer myself. Yeah, so I thought it's good to share that little story of the Israeli Defense Force colonel.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I feel like that gives a good picture of how it's a different context and different situation here in Hawaii and in Israel, Palestine. Thank you, Dr. Sai. Well, that concludes our presentation for tonight. Linda, let me pass it to you just if there's any concluding remarks you want to make. Thank you, Dr. Sai.
Thank you, Cassie, and thank you so much, Dr. Sai. I'm continually impressed with how you explain with such clarity information that is critically important for us to understand and also complex. Mahalo to everyone for being with us this week. We'll be back the same time next week. Aloha to everyone.